For those who don't know, in September 1986, a massive chunk of ice broke off from the edge of the Filchner ice shelf in West Antarctica. It was simply called A23A at that time. But even though it had a simple name, scientists quickly noticed that this wasn't just an ordinary iceberg. In fact, it was the largest iceberg in the world. Its area is approximately 4,170 square kilometers. It's like looking at a floating giant island of ice that's more than 5 times bigger than New York City. Now, as the years went by, it just stopped in one part of the sea. It's like a permanent ice island now, embedded in the freezing waters of Antarctica. But what's surprising is that after more than 3 decades, something strange happened. In 2023, the A23A started moving again. It's as if the giant that had been sleeping in this frozen world woke up once more. Now, it's slowly drifting into the Weddell Sea beside Antarctica and is moving more than 150 kilometers each month. And for many scientists, this is a serious warning, because when a massive iceberg starts moving again after staying still for many years, it could mean that a major change is happening in Antarctica. And according to most experts, this is not a good sign. But the question now is, how important really is this frozen continent? And here are more important questions. What could happen if all the ice in Antarctica completely melts? And what would the world look like if the sea level rises higher than many buildings? And is it also true that there is blood flowing here coming from the glacier? And another mind-blowing question is, why are so many meteorites found here? And is it possible that Antarctica could become green again someday? In this video, we will find out all about that. But before we start, don't forget to like this video. It's a big deal for us content creators. Thank you very much, and now let's get started. To start, let's first discuss some important things. For those who don't know, long ago, there were already old maps showing a mysterious land at the edge of the world. This is often called the Southern Land, or sometimes Terra Incognita, which means an unknown place. Even the Greek philosopher Aristotle mentioned a region at the southernmost part of the earth around 350 BC in his book about weather and nature. But what's surprising is that it was only in the 19th century when people finally confirmed the existence of Antarctica, and only then did they consider it as a real, true continent. The first official sighting of it only happened in 1820, and to understand how late this was in human history, just think about it. At that time, the battery had already been invented. Photography also existed. Even soft drinks were already around back then. And Christopher Columbus had already discovered America more than 3 centuries before Antarctica was even seen. And even after they saw it, many still didn't immediately believe that it was an entire continent. It took almost 2 decades before it was officially recognized as a separate continent, and not just a simple island. Despite this, as scientists studied Antarctica more, they became even more amazed, because it turns out it's not just a cold place. It's also actually very large. It covers more than 14.2 million square kilometers, making it the 5th largest continent on Earth. It's almost 1.5 times bigger than the entire United States. Its coastline stretches for nearly 18,000 kilometers. But as the saying goes, that's just the tip of the iceberg, because the truly terrifying secret of Antarctica lies beneath its ice. This is where the largest glaciers on the planet can be found. In fact, almost 90% of all the ice on Earth is in Antarctica. This means that almost all of the frozen water in the world is found here in just one continent. And even if we remove the sea glaciers and look only at the glaciers that are actually on land, it still reaches almost 14 million square kilometers of thick ice. And what's even more surprising is the amount of ice stored here. It's estimated that there are around 26.5 million cubic kilometers of ice in Antarctica. And to understand how heavy that is, 1 cubic kilometer of ice weighs almost 0.92 gigatons. In other words, the entire ice sheet of Antarctica weighs approximately 24,300,000 380,000 gigatons. And there are still places here where the ice is more than 4 kilometers thick. That's even higher than many mountains. But here's the scariest question. What would happen if all of that melted? According to scientists, if all the ice in Antarctica completely disappeared, the world's sea level would rise by about 58 meters. That's almost 190 feet if you add it up. If that happens, many famous cities around the world could end up completely submerged. Cities like New York City and London could disappear from the map because of flooding. And the Netherlands, which is already below sea level, would really be wiped off the world map. But there's another important detail here. The ice in Antarctica isn't just ordinary water. It's fresh water. In fact, almost 70% of all the fresh water on Earth is stored here. And this is what makes Antarctica even more unique. Because even though it's surrounded by so much ice, it's still considered a desert. Yes, a desert. And not just any desert. In fact, it's the driest desert in the whole world. But how did that happen? How did a place with the most ice and water on the whole planet become a desert? Because when we hear the word desert, automatically we think of scorching heat, vast stretches of sand, and huge sandstorms like in the Sahara Desert. But according to scientists, most people's common idea about deserts is actually wrong. Because the real basis for calling a place a desert isn't heat, but the lack of rain. In other words, if there's little to no precipitation, hardly any rain or moisture, it can already be considered a desert, even if it's surrounded by ice. And that's exactly what Antarctica is like. At the South Pole, the average precipitation each year is only around 15 millimeters. That's very little. To give you an idea of how little that is, the Sahara Desert itself actually receives more rain each year, and that's around 76 millimeters. Yes, the Sahara is actually wetter than Antarctica. There are some coastal areas in Antarctica that sometimes experience a little snow or precipitation, but it's still very rare, and there's very little of it. So overall, the continent remains extremely dry. So even though it's covered with very thick ice, it's still officially called a true desert. And what's even more surprising is that the thick ice we see today didn't just form in a few years or centuries. It took millions of years for the massive layer of ice in Antarctica to form. And if you think that place is already extremely dry, there's something even more intense. There's a part of Antarctica that, according to scientists, hasn't experienced rain or any precipitation for almost 2 million years. That means there's a place on Earth that has had almost no rain for 2 million years. And later, we'll also talk about why that place looks almost like another planet. Going back, another unique thing about Antarctica is that it doesn't really have an owner. It's not a country, nor is it a colony. It's true that some countries have claimed certain parts of it, but overall, there is no official country that owns Antarctica. But even so, it still has its own phone code, internet domain, which is AQ, and even its own flag. It's really like a separate world from what we're used to. And there are really a lot of things in Antarctica that don't follow the ordinary rules of Earth. For example, time zones here are almost meaningless. In other parts of the world, it's clear what time it is, morning, noon, or night. But in Antarctica, it depends on which research station you're in. Each station uses its own time. And if you ask what time it is in Antarctica right now, that's kind of a trick question. Because at the South Pole, there are times when the sun almost never sets. From September 21st to March 23rd, what's called Polar Day occurs. During that time, it never really gets dark. The sun just circles around the horizon continuously. It's like one very long day that lasts for 184 normal days. After this, the polar night comes. It's a long period of almost continuous darkness. Because of this, there's hardly any clear separation between day and night in Antarctica. And of course, because of the extremely harsh conditions there, almost no one wants to live there permanently. There are almost no permanent residents in Antarctica. But even so, there are still people who live there every year. Usually there are around 1,000 to 5,000 people in Antarctica, depending on the season. Most of them are scientists, researchers, government personnel, and sometimes even their families. In the more accessible parts of Antarctica, the requirements are already strict before you are even allowed to join an expedition. But as you go farther into more dangerous areas, the rules become even stricter. And there's one requirement that's really surprising. In some missions, people who haven't had their appendix removed may not be allowed to join. It's kind of strange, isn't it? But why do you need to have your appendix removed before going to Antarctica? Is there a deadly virus there that attacks the appendix? The answer is connected to a real event that almost turned into a tragedy. On April 29, 1961, a 27-year-old Soviet doctor named Leonid Drogosov suddenly felt extreme weakness, fever, vomiting, and severe pain on the right side of his abdomen. And because he was the only doctor in their 13-member expedition, he had no other choice but to examine his own body. After the examination, a frightening diagnosis emerged: acute appendicitis. And to make matters worse, there was no nearby airplane that could rescue him. The weather was also really bad at that time, making evacuation impossible. In other words, it was as if he had been sentenced to death. But instead of giving up, he did something almost impossible to believe. He decided to operate on his own appendix. Yes, he performed an appendectomy on himself, because according to him, that was the only way left for him to survive. And even though the operation was extremely difficult, very dangerous, and almost unbelievable, it was successful. And because of the incredible courage he showed, Leonid Drogosov became famous all over the world. Now, aside from this, if you think about it, having days or nights that last for half a year is probably enough reason to feel like Antarctica isn't even Earth anymore. It's like a distant exoplanet orbiting in another part of the galaxy. But there's another thing that makes you feel even more like you're in outer space while you're in Antarctica. And no, we're not talking about aliens yet, not for now, because there's another kind of visitor that regularly comes to this place: meteorites. In fact, Antarctica is one of the best places on Earth to look for meteorites from outer space. Almost 2/3 of all the meteorites found on the planet were discovered right here, and it's only natural for many to wonder, why here? Is Antarctica hit by meteorites more often than other places? For some, conspiracy theories might come to mind right away, but the real reason is much simpler. It's not that more meteorites fall here, it's just that they're much easier to find. Because the surroundings are so white, even a small dark rock on the ice is easy to spot. It's like dropping a piece of charcoal on white paper. Aside from that, the air in Antarctica is extremely dry. That's why meteorites are less damaged here compared to other parts of the world. And even if they sink into the snow, the movement of the glacier has a unique effect. It doesn't allow the meteorites to sink too deep. Instead, they often just stay close to the surface. That's why for scientists, Antarctica is like a natural treasure trove. During the expedition from 2022 to 2023, an international research team immediately found 5 new meteorites, and that was after only a short search. And one of those weighs 7.6 kilograms. That's really big for a meteorite. According to Maria Valdez from the Field Museum of Natural History and the University of Chicago, approximately 45,000 meteorites have been brought from Antarctica in just the past century. And out of all those, only about 100 are as big or bigger than the meteorite that was found by that expedition. That means discoveries like that are extremely rare. But even though we usually think of nothing but ice and snow when we talk about Antarctica, that doesn't mean that's all you'll find there, because there are places in Antarctica that look like mountains in Europe. Sometimes, when you look at some pictures of it, you might even mistake it for the Swiss Alps. But there's one detail that will immediately remind you that you're really in Antarctica: the emperor penguins. Because emperor penguins can only be found here and nowhere else on Earth. And every year from November to March, when it's summer in the southern hemisphere, cruise ships visit Antarctica. Yes, there's also tourism in the coldest continent in the world. But as you go further south into the deepest parts of Antarctica, especially during winter, that's when you'll truly feel its harshness. the kind of cold that feels like it can pierce right through your bones. In fact, the lowest temperature ever recorded on Earth also happened here. In 2010, a temperature of negative 92 degrees Celsius was recorded in Antarctica. That is the coldest temperature ever recorded on the entire planet. And while we're talking about Antarctica, there's another thing that almost everyone has heard of, the ozone hole. But even though that term is popular, many people don't really fully understand how serious it is. The ozone hole is a part of the atmosphere where the concentration of ozone drops significantly. And the ozone layer is very important because it serves as Earth's shield against the dangerous ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Without it, life on the planet would be much more dangerous. But here's something that many people often misunderstand. The ozone hole in Antarctica is not a permanent hole that's open all year round. It's a seasonal phenomenon. This means it appears and shrinks depending on the season. British scientists first discovered this problem in 1985. They noticed that every August there's a large part of the atmosphere over Antarctica with a very low ozone concentration, and by December it almost disappears. Because of this, the scientific community immediately became concerned, because if this continues to get worse, it could have a huge impact on the entire Earth. And according to the most widely accepted explanation by scientists, humans are also the main reason for this. In particular, the use of chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, and more than 100 other harmful chemicals. Because of serious concern, different countries acted quickly. In 1985, the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer was signed, and just 2 years later, this was followed by the Montreal Protocol in September 1987. Since then, the situation has gradually improved. Every year, researchers have observed that the ozone hole is getting smaller and smaller. There are even some optimists who believe that it might completely disappear by 2060. And according to some United Nations reports, that could really happen. But in recent years, especially in 2023, new concerns have arisen again. Based on satellite data from the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, scientists noticed that the ozone hole formed earlier that year. Usually it appears later, but in 2023 it already started in August. And for the experts, that's not normal. According to Martin Duker from the University of New South Wales, the very early formation of the ozone hole was extremely unexpected. And if the ozone hole gets even bigger, it's possible that the Southern Ocean will get even warmer. That's a problem because Antarctica is already experiencing record low sea ice levels. In addition, the increase in ultraviolet radiation could also change wind patterns around Antarctica. And when that happens, the loss of ice will accelerate even more. At this point, you can't help but think maybe 2023 is enough. It feels like the planet's problems just keep coming one after another. But according to scientists, there's still not enough information to make final conclusions. And while Antarctica remains one of the most dangerous and mysterious places on Earth, we will continue to discover even more strange secrets that are hidden there. In most places in the world, a river is just ordinary, but in Antarctica, it's an extraordinary miracle. This is the Onyx River, the longest river in Antarctica, even though it's only about 32 kilometers long. But what's most unique about it is that it only flows for about 2 months each year. For almost the entire year, its riverbed is just frozen. But when the short Antarctic summer arrives, the river suddenly comes to life and starts flowing through the middle of the coldest continent. This happens because of the unique water system beneath Antarctica. Under the thick glaciers, there are hidden subglacial lakes and underground streams. When the ice partially melts during summer, the water accumulates until it eventually escapes and forms rivers, like the Onyx River. And even though there are no fish here, it serves as a lifeline for microorganisms and algae that can survive in the harsh climate of Antarctica. But what's even more surprising is where it flows, because it is found in the driest place on Earth. This is the McMurdo Dry Valleys, a place that has had almost no precipitation for 2 million years. Even some parts of the Atacama Desert seem like an oasis compared to this. This place is almost lifeless. In some soil samples, researchers really found no signs of life. Because of this, it is often compared to Mars. Because its conditions are so similar to those on Mars, NASA even used it as a testing ground for the Viking landers. But there's another mystery here. Scattered throughout the valleys are mummy-like seal carcasses that may have been there for hundreds or even thousands of years. To this day, scientists are still not sure why the seals ended up in such a remote place. One of the reasons why it's so dry here is because of what's called katabatic winds. These are extremely cold and dry winds that sometimes reach speeds of up to 320 kilometers per hour. Because of these winds, the area has remained almost ice-free for around 8 million years. But this is where Antarctica becomes even more unique. Right next to the driest place on Earth, there's a waterfall that's blood red in color. This is Blood Falls. This was discovered in 1911 by Griffith Taylor. At first, they thought that the red color was just caused by algae. But according to scientists, it actually comes from water with a high iron content, from beneath the glacier. When the water comes out and mixes with oxygen, it forms iron oxides that give it a blood-like appearance. What's even more amazing is that there are microbes living in the water even without sunlight and with almost no oxygen. Because of this, Blood Falls has become important in astrobiology research. Scientists believe that this could help answer whether life is possible on Mars, Europa, and Titan. And Antarctica doesn't just have deserts and glaciers. There are also giant mountains here. The highest is the Vinson Massif, which stands at 4,892 meters. But even more surprising, there's also an active volcano in Antarctica. This is Mount Erebus, a volcano that has been active for more than 1.3 million years. And inside its crater, there's a lava lake that has been continuously boiling since the early 1970s. Yes, there's literally a lake of lava in the middle of the coldest place on Earth. Even so, aside from being a unique volcano, Mount Erebus also has a dark history. On November 28, 1979, an Air New Zealand DC-10 passenger plane crashed straight into the side of the volcano. All 257 people on board, including the crew and passengers, died. It was one of the deadliest tragedies in the history of Antarctica. And this just shows that no matter how beautiful this place is, it is still very dangerous. But despite the danger, many explorers and scientists still risk their lives to study Antarctica. And even today, there are still traces of their heroism. One of the most famous are the historic huts left behind by the first Antarctic explorers. On Ross Island, there are several old huts that were once used by Robert Falcon Scott and Ernest Shackleton. During the so-called heroic age of Antarctic exploration, Ernest Shackleton's hut, built in 1907, is like a frozen time capsule. Inside it, you can still see old medicines, sleeping bags, canned food, and even bread left behind by the explorers more than a century ago. Because of the extremely cold and dry climate of Antarctica, these items are almost perfectly preserved. The same goes for Robert Falcon Scott's hut, which was built in 1911. They even left enough supplies there. These were enough to support more than a dozen people for over a year. And surprisingly, some of the food there is still edible even today. But what's even more surprising is that there is a real small town in Antarctica. This is Villa Las Estrellas, a Chilean settlement with a school, a small supermarket, a library, a hospital, internet, and even a post office. This is one of the 2 permanently populated settlements in Antarctica. Although it's small, there are around 80 to 100 residents here, depending on the season. But because the medical facilities are limited, residents are even required to have an appendectomy before living there to avoid emergencies. And of course, Antarctica wouldn't be complete without talking about its most famous place, the South Pole. It's also known as the geographic South Pole, or 90 degrees south. This is the southernmost point of the Earth where the planet's axis of rotation meets. It is located in a vast, quiet, and almost endless white landscape that is around 2,835 meters above sea level. And if you ever get here, you'll notice that the surroundings are extremely simple. There are no trees, no mountains, almost nothing but ice as far as the eye can see. But there is one thing there that is special, a metal rod that serves as the exact marker of the South Pole. And it's interesting because every year it gets moved slightly. That's because even the ice in Antarctica slowly shifts every year. Still, if you think the South Pole is extremely lonely and isolated, that feeling might lessen a bit when you see the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. This is a research station located very close to the geographic South Pole. And for those who want to take pictures, there's even a special spot here called the ceremonial South Pole. But even though there are people and modern stations now in Antarctica, it still remains one of the harshest environments on Earth. And it's surprising to think that before, this continent looked very different. Millions of years ago, Antarctica wasn't all ice. There were forests here, there were plants, and there were dinosaurs roaming the land that is now covered by thick glaciers. Between 145 million and 66 million years ago, there were even palm trees along the coast of Antarctica, and the average temperature back then was around 20 degrees Celsius. Scientists call this period the Eocene greenhouse period, when carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were high, making Earth's climate extremely hot. And not only that, Antarctica was also much closer to the equator back then. But as millions of years passed, it kept drifting. It had forests that lasted for millennia. Now, only fossils of plants and ancient animals remain as evidence of the once green Antarctica. But there's something even more mind-blowing beneath its ice, because under the thick glaciers of Antarctica, there are hidden lakes. And some of these may have existed even before the continent was covered in ice. One of the most famous is Lake Vostok. It was discovered in the late 1990s near the Russian research station Vostok. But scientists haven't seen it directly because it's hidden under almost 4 kilometers of ice. It was only through their radar technology that they discovered there was a huge lake under the glacier. And this isn't a small lake. It stretches to around 160 kilometers long and almost 30 kilometers wide. It's like a whole hidden world beneath Antarctica. Because of this, scientists became extremely interested. The ice above the lake is like a history book of Earth. Information about the atmosphere, dust, and climate of the planet from millions of years ago is preserved here. But the most exciting question is, could there be life inside the lake? After a long drilling project that began in 1989, they finally reached the lake in 2012. And when they studied the samples from it, they made a surprising discovery. More than 4,000 species of bacteria were found in these extreme conditions.
Ang natagpuan sa matinding
And cold wasn't the only problem there. Because of the weight of the thick ice above it, the pressure inside the lake reaches around 300 atmospheres. In other words, there are organisms that can survive in a place that's almost impossible for normal life. And once again, scientists were left pondering a big question. Is there life under the ice of Antarctica? Is it also possible that there is life under the frozen sea? Other planets or moons in space? Now, let's go back. The excitement of the scientists about Lake Vostok didn't last long. Eventually, it was discovered that most of the microorganisms they found actually came from the drilling fluid used to bore through the ice. In other words, the samples were contaminated, and it turned out that there was almost no life in the surface waters of the lake. Almost. Because they still discovered one thing. A strange bacterium called W12310. And this is where everything became interesting. When its genetics were analyzed, it matched less than 86% with known organisms on Earth. And according to scientists, an organism needs at least a 90% genetic match before it can be considered an existing species. This means it could possibly be a new type of bacteria that science has never seen before. Even though these aren't the monsters or alien creatures that some people expected, this is still a major discovery. And as research in Antarctica continues, more and more ancient secrets are slowly emerging from beneath the ice. One of the most surprising discoveries happened in 2020. A report in Nature announced the discovery of a fossil of a giant bony-toothed bird that once flew over Antarctica. Its remains were first discovered back in the 1980s, but it was only recently that scientists realized how important they were. This creature belonged to a certain group. Called pelagornitids, these are said to be ancient predatory seabirds with bone-like teeth on their beaks. These aren't real teeth, but they're enough to make them look terrifying. And most surprising of all, they were enormous. According to researchers, these birds had a wingspan of 5 to 6 meters, almost 20 feet. That's even bigger than most modern birds today. According to Peter Close from the University of California, Berkeley, these birds quickly became giants after the dinosaurs disappeared. For millions of years, they ruled the skies above Antarctica's ancient seas. And it's possible that there are still many fossils of these creatures hidden beneath the ice, because in ancient times, Antarctica was not frozen. In fact, there were times back then when the temperature of the Southern Ocean reached around 30 degrees Celsius. Antarctica was warm, green, and full of life back then. But according to scientists, everything changed because of the sharp rise in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which led to the intense greenhouse effect we see today. Once again, that fear is returning, because according to many experts, the Earth is warming faster now than at almost any other time in the planet's history. And this time, it's not volcanoes that are the main cause, but modern human industry. In fact, some parts of West Antarctica are already starting to melt, and even though the continent won't turn green again in the next few decades, it's clear to scientists that the changes have already begun. But there's a big problem. If the ice at the poles completely melts, it won't just be Antarctica that changes, but the whole world. Oh no,